than ever before, 100 million. The reasons are a combination of COVID-19, conflict and climate change. Let's take a closer look at the numbers. Joining us to talk about the experiences of refugees, internally displaced people and stateless people, we have Mary, Camila and Taban. Ladies, thank you so much for joining our conversation. Mary, will you remind our audience who you are and what you do?
Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Maker. I am a South Sudanese refugee that has lived in Kakuma refugee camp my whole life. I work with UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the United Nations Refugee Agency, and I work to advocate for refugees.
Thank you, Mary. Hear more from you in a moment. Camila, welcome to the stream. Please introduce yourself to our audience.
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Camila Alvarez. I'm the legal director at the Central American Resource Center, or CARECEN, in Los Angeles. We are an organization that does direct immigration legal services for refugees, including asylees, and organizing and advocacy around immigrants' rights issues.
All right, good to have you. Taban, welcome to the stream. Please introduce yourself to our international audience around the world.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi, I'm Taban Sharesh. I'm the founder of the Lotus Flower, and I'm also a One Young World ambassador. We support women and girls impacted by conflict and displacement, and we have safe social spaces inside refugee camps. And I'm also a genocide survivor myself, as well as being a stateless person. So I am Kurdish by background.
Thank you, ladies, for being part of our panel. If you would like to talk to Taban, Camila or Mary, you can do so on YouTube. Put your comments or questions right here and be part of today's show. Taban, do you remember, is there one searing memory from when you were a refugee that you would want to share with our audience? Because that connection, that connecting, the idea that this is possible, it could happen to me, what would you share? What would be the one instance that you would share with our audience?
I think for me, I would most probably share the moment that instigated it all for me to become a refugee. I was a 4-year-old child playing in my grandmother's garden. I remember quite clearly playing with my doll, and there was a loud thud rattling noise on the garden gate. It was like a metal gate, and the floor was concrete, so you can imagine what sound that would make. And it startled me as a child. And I remember my uncle running out to open the gate. And for me as a child, I saw him and ran to him for safety. But when he opened the gate, it was 2 Iraqi soldiers standing there in front of us. And that basically started off the persecution of us being taken to prison, and then, you know, from there being destined to be buried alive, but we had a miraculous escape, and then dodging mines, bombs and bullets while trying to flee, going hiding, and my father being poisoned, and then eventually, you know, from the age of 4 to 6, at the age of 6, arriving in the UK as a refugee. So by that point, within 2 years, yeah. I'd seen quite a lot.
Oh my goodness. And as a child, Mary, I'm thinking about that word refugee. It's so loaded for many people around the world because they haven't really experienced what it truly means. Why do you think that often people think refugee and they're not welcoming when that word comes up? Because this is part of the reason why we have 100 million people forcibly displaced. They don't need to be displaced if we're welcoming. Mary?
When people hear the word refugee, it comes with the word stranger. I hate the word stranger. And it's so much like connotated and attached to the word refugee. When people hear the word refugee, they think of people coming into our borders, they're coming to take over our space, then our government has to share stuff with them. And it really becomes like a big weight on someone that actually does not understand who is a refugee. Yeah. The fact that people don't understand the meaning of refugee, people have the dictionary explanation of refugee rather than the stories of refugee, the reason why a refugee is in fact seeking for safety in their borders. And I don't know how to just put it simple, but it comes off as that strange, that othering of they're not us.
Yeah. Camila, you see this on a daily basis. You're nodding your head. Articulate your nod.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with Mary and couldn't have put it better that a lot of folks, when they hear the word refugee, think stranger, they think other, not thinking about the fact that, as you said, Femi, this could happen to anyone at any time. We are seeing unprecedented global crises, and it really could happen to anyone. In the United States in particular, there's been so much harmful rhetoric against immigrants as a whole, and in particular refugees. This othering, this criminalization, especially of Central American and Latinx refugees that are really just seeking asylum. I hear so much in my work, and I live in a very progressive area in Los Angeles, even here. How do you know that they're telling the truth? How do you know that things are as bad as they are? And if you sat down with some of my clients and with some of our community members and just listened to their stories, listened to who they are as people, you would have no doubt in your mind that these folks are telling the truth and are living through very unspeakable things and are deserving of refugee protections.
There are so many crises around the world in terms of refugees or migrants or displaced people that we have a packed show of contributors. So I want to bring in Sahat from the world's largest refugee camp, and that is in Cox's Bazar. This is what he told us a few hours earlier. Taban, I'd like you to have a listen to him, because it's really, how do you solve the issue of people getting out of these camps? Because often they're there for many, many years. Here is Sahat.
I, my family, and 1 million other people of my community became refugees in 2017. It's already 5 years we have been living here in this refugee camp. Our life have not been changed. Even our lives are getting worse day after day. So I would like to request international community to come forward and help us for going back to our country, Myanmar.
So much faith in the international community there from Sahat. I hear that often. If the international community only knew how much we were suffering, they would come and help us. Taban, reality.
I think the reality is, sadly, when, and we've seen this in different types of conflict, when it's all over the media and it's headline news, then that particular region will get lots of attention. And then once that dies down, all the support and all the funding and all the hopes that you had for having help kind of goes with it as well. And so they become like forgotten groups of people. And it varies in different situations. For example, in Cox's Bazar, I know that, the legalities of your status and what you can do and can't do as a refugee, it has a massive impact. For example, the region that we work in, we have lots of internally displaced people. So, for example, they might still have the right to work. They might still have the right, they have the right to their producing identity documents and things like that. But if you're in another region where you're in limbo, your legal status is in limbo, you almost have nothing, and you are literally stuck in these camps, and there's nothing anyone can do. And sadly, what we've seen as well in terms of our work's been impacted, you see funding going out from the region and their priorities are kind of allocated to the most recent conflict or some other situation. So you really do get millions of people in camps around the world kind of forgotten because it's no longer in the headlines, sadly.
I see Mary nodding and I see Camila nodding as well. Mary, you go first.
Making refugee ship like a trend is a big thing. When the Ukraine crisis came through, everyone is posting about it. And a few months in right now, it's starting to feel like the COVID report, where it's subsiding, it's going down. And for you as a refugee that is in that situation, it's your story is still with you. You're still in that situation, and all of a sudden you've been forgotten. For someone like me that came to the refugee camp when I was 2 to 4 years old, that 1 month turns into 10, into 1 year, into 10 years, and no one remembers your story, as if everyone is waiting for that next big thing to happen again to South Sudan, and then my story will be covered again, or like waiting for the 20th of June for my story to be out again on World Refugee Day.
Wait for World Refugee Day so that everyone starts thinking about refugees for one day of the year, unless the headlines push refugees back into the headlines again. Earlier on today, Filippo Grandi, who's the High Commissioner of the UN Refugee Agency, he spoke to us, Camila, about this issue, about certain issues and certain refugees and certain displaced people being in the headlines and then being forgotten. And we said, what would you say to donors? This is what he told us. And then Camila, please come off the back of the UN High Commissioner for the UNHCR.
All those operations at the moment are struggling. All those responses are struggling and need resources. And what I tell all donors is, I understand that Ukrainian refugees need support. But if somebody flees home because of war, persecution, and violence, anybody fleeing for these reasons deserves the same support wherever they are.
Camila, thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree. I also think it's more than donors. It's the world as a whole, and also politicians. One thing that we're seeing in the United States is this disparate treatment of different kinds of refugees, in particular with Ukrainian refugees. And I want to preface this by saying that the crisis in Ukraine is horrible, and Ukrainian refugees are 100% deserving of protections and resources. At the same time, we're seeing that at least in the United States, there are other groups who are not getting the same protections and resources, although they are undergoing very similar crises for way longer periods of time. So, for example, in the United States, there's a law called temporary protected status, where a country can be designated a temporary protected status, TPS, country, and folks from that country receive temporary protections in the United States, like work authorization, and they do not have to live with the fear that they'll be deported. So the Ukrainian crisis we saw really take the world's attention in February of this year. By April, there was a United States designation of Ukraine as a country that would receive temporary protected status. At the same time, we saw Cameroon get designated for temporary protected status, where groups have been advocating for TPS for Cameroon for years before the United States government actually designated them. At the same time, we saw the world react to the crisis in Afghanistan once the Taliban took over. That was August of last year. Afghanistan did not get designated for temporary protected status until May of this year.
Right.
And so you see this
Camila,
disparate treatment.
will you just be really... I'm just going to ask you to take off the filter here. You basically did a list of how treatment is different. And do you want to just be very candid? What are you saying? Be bold, just say it. Be frank.
What I'm saying is that there was preferential treatment to white refugees in the United States. White refugees from Ukraine saw protections before Middle Eastern and Black refugees in the United States. And that is a treatment that may not have been intentional, but is real. And it affects people.
It may not have been intentional. Are you being really honest there, or are you just trying to make sure that you don't get in trouble for the future?
You're right. Thank you for calling me out on that. I believe it was intentional.
It was intentional.
We're living in
Do
a
not
very racist
tell fibs. Do not tell fibs on the stream. All right, I've got one. Go ahead, Taran. Yeah.
I mean, what we've been seeing in the UK, it's a completely racist policy that's been implemented. It's very, very clear in terms of the refugees that are being supported are white refugees, and if you're any shade darker than white, then you will be, and this is from my personal opinion, not One Young World, but you'll be flown to Rwanda as a solution. I mean, I think that's absolutely ridiculous. And I think the Ukrainian war, and I'm not taking away from it, I feel for the people. I've experienced it, seen it, and we help people that currently have experienced it. So I'm not taking away from that. But what it's done is it's completely lifted the
pretending that there's a refugee issue where it's actually, we have a black-brown people issue, not a refugee issue. Let me back that up with something quite solid. So I want to take you to the Polish border in February of this year, when people who were living in Ukraine were trying to get out of Ukraine. Let me show you what we saw, and one student telling her story, and then Mary, love you to react. Here we go.
There's been a lot of segregation and racism from the people who managed to actually get to the passport control. It seems like there's a hierarchy of Ukrainians first, Indians second, Africans last.
Mary.
It's sickening to watch these videos over and over again. Anytime I'm watching it, it's just crazy, because being in that situation, you can inherently see the racism at hand, and just fleeing in itself it's just so much trauma around it, and having to seek safety and being able to ask people to actually give you safety is absurd. You shouldn't be asking people for safety. It's our collective human responsibility to give everybody safety, you know, and watching these videos, I watched it like throughout the whole February, and it just doesn't, I'm losing even words on what to say, but the reality is, as a refugee trying to cross borders, it's regardless of your race or where you're coming from, you need safety. That's a code for war. I don't know what codes are there, but that in itself should tell you that you should be welcoming and you should give everybody safety despite where they're coming from.
I have a theory that I want to put to you, Camila and Taban, and that is that what we saw with Ukraine is a little bit like what we saw with COVID-19. We were told that there weren't resources, there wasn't funding, we couldn't mobilize to do all sorts of very critical things very fast. And then COVID happened, and bang, there was the money. Ukrainian refugees needed assistance, and boom, there were all the programs. They were allowed to work, they were allowed to stay in countries, people gave them their homes. It is possible. So if I was going to take away a positive takeaway from what we have learned at this moment, is the racism, the prejudice is now being, there's light being shone on that. And is that possible, or am I being too optimistic of what we have learned from the Ukraine crisis, which is still, of course, ongoing? Camila, you go first.
I will say that I agree with you that it has shown some light. Whether it will actually impact people caring is a different story. Because as with the COVID-19 crisis, people cared until they didn't. And so there is this light being shown on this racism problem. However, how do we get the global community to care and to move politicians and different key stakeholders into eliminating that racism is a completely different story. I will say that we saw that same racism at the border with the different treatment of Ukrainians being let into this country to seek asylum in the United States, just as soon as they came, being let in, where we saw Black and brown immigrants being detained outside of the country for months and for years. And to be honest, that has been a problem that's been right in people's backyards in the United States for a while, and they encourage it. And so I think there has to be this reckoning. of the global community that we see this racism, the light's being shown, but what do we do now? What do we demand of the political actors? What do we demand of donors to say, this can't happen? And it's going to take everybody seeing it, understanding about it, and caring about it, and then taking the next step. How do I engage and take action and push folks that are in power to change these racist policies?
When we have 100 million forcibly displaced people around the world, it means that our approach to displaced people needs some overhauling, perhaps, or maybe we're not asking the right questions. For instance, do not refugees, displaced people themselves have to be at the heart of the solution, of finding the solutions? Taban, you're nodding your head, and Mary's like, yes, let me get at you. So Taban, you go first of all, because often these programs are put together and nobody's asked the people who are displaced, what do you need? Taban, but you don't do that. That's where you start. That's your starting point, correct?
That's exactly, I think I've had so many discussions this week, and, it's been, what's the solution? And I've turned around and said, well, why don't you bring the refugees, the people that are actually experiencing it, to the table? Ask them what kind of solutions they'd like to see. I know in our centres, and we, if you just take it down to the small community level, in our centres, when we try and implement projects, we ask the women and girls what kind of projects they'd like to see, because they're the ones living in the camps. They're the ones that know what kind of things they'd like to experience on a day-to-day basis. And it's exactly the same kind of thinking. Ask the questions, include them in the solutions, find out what solutions would be best from their perspective. I mean, we talk about refugees, but I think it's really important for the global community, people, to start bringing them into the discussions and actually asking them what they would like to see.
Mary?
I just feel, just like she has just said it, most of the time it's like you want to help a community, but you actually don't understand the community. To be able to help the refugees, first to understand who is a refugee, what does the refugee need, and that means not making the refugees, but letting the refugees tell their own stories from their own perspective. They won't sugarcoat anything, give them the space and the platform to be able to put out their frustrations and what they actually need. In that way, we are able to help more and more refugees. And here's the mistake that most organizations do, where they think they've already made the plans on how they're going to help the refugee, and the refugee is not even aware of it. So when you come in, you're wasting the energy and the time, where like when we are fleeing, I fled as a kid. My mom fled as a farmer. My dad was a politician, and everyone has skills and resources to bring forward. So it's all about understanding what resources already exist in the refugee camp. Then how can you add to it as an NGO, as an organization that wants to help refugees?
Right.
Understanding that dynamic in itself is the key.
All right. I'm going to leave you with one more refugee story, and that's one, of course, you know very well, and that one comes from Ukraine. Here's Serhey.
More than 7 million people moved from the battle zones in the east to central and western Ukraine. And now they are safe, but they are not all right. They are accommodated in the very inconvenient conditions of the collective transit centers. They don't have any employment. They suffer shortage of the basic means for survival, like food and hygiene. And they are traumatized. They are shocked, scared. They lost their relatives, and they need psychological support, therapy, counseling, and children need very basic things like game, play, entertainment.
Thank you, Serhey. Thank you to everybody who contributed to this show, to Mary, Camila, Taban, to you online on YouTube. We really appreciate you. Thanks so much for being part of today's program. And I feel for me, the takeaway is let's treat every displaced, stateless refugee as if they were coming out of Ukraine. I feel like there, somewhere, is a solution to how we look after the world when they're moved out of their own homes. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Take care.
On On counting the cost, China has announced measures to put its economy back on track. Can it succeed? The UK plans to override the Northern Ireland Protocol as a trade war with the EU about to start. And the tourism industry had a strong start to the year. Will that continue? Counting the cost on Al Jazeera.
A Turkish artist, an internationally renowned painter who has been blind from birth, Al Jazeera World meets an inspirational figure for visually impaired people worldwide.
This man is able to inspire so many people, sighted, unsighted. It doesn't matter.
Sharing new artistic techniques, fingertips that make the impossible possible. Painting in the dark on Al Jazeera.
But what's most important to me is talking to people, understanding what they're going through. Here at Al Jazeera, we believe everyone has a story worth hearing.
Israel's struggling coalition government collapses. For the 5th time in just over 3 years, voters will head back to the polls. I'm Rob Matheson. This is Al Jazeera live from Doha. Also coming up, a massacre in Mali. More than 130 people are killed in attacks on several villages. Struggling to get aid into flood-hit India and Bangladesh, the military steps in to airlift food and fuel to submerge towns and villages. And Colombia's last rebel group says it's ready for peace talks with the new president. Israel's fragile coalition government is dissolving parliament after only a year in office. The country's going to have to hold its 5th election in less than 3.5 years. The coalition failed to renew a law on the status of Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank. Foreign Minister Yair Lapid will take over from Naftali Bennett as an interim prime minister until the poll that's expected in October.
On Friday, I held a series of talks with legal and security officials, and I realised that in 10 days, with the expiration of the West Bank regulations, Israel will experience serious security damages and legal chaos. I couldn't allow that. We spared no efforts to galvanise whomever was needed to pass the regulations, but unfortunately our efforts bore no fruit. Therefore, my friend and I decided to act together to dissolve Parliament and set an agreed-upon date for elections.
Mali's military rulers have declared 3 days of national mourning. That's after fighters killed 132 people in several villages. Witnesses say it was a revenge attack. Barbara Ngopa reports.
Malian television showed soldiers and a regional governor as they reassured villagers. The government is blaming an al-Qaeda-linked group for the violence.
The government of the Republic of Mali deeply regrets to inform that the peaceful populations were the subject of cowardly and barbaric terrorist attacks during the nights of the 18th and 19th of June 2022. A total of 132 civilians were killed by Amadou Koufa's fighters Masina Katiba. Several of the attackers have been formally identified.
A local politician says the night raids were revenge attacks.
2 weeks ago, the army was present on the ground to do patrols. During the patrols, there were clashes with the terrorists, and about 12 terrorists were killed. After the armed and security forces left, around 4 p.m. on Friday, the terrorists came on about 50 to 60 motorcycles to take the town of Dayalasugou hostage.
Mali was plunged into crisis after a coup in 2012. France intervened after al-Qaeda and ISIL-linked groups hijacked a breakaway movement and seized swathes of territory. But despite a peacekeeping mission in northern Mali, armed groups continue to operate in the vast Sahel region. Mali's civilian government was overthrown in a military coup in May last year. This latest attack raises fears that the new military leaders are failing to restore order. Barbara Ngopa, Al Jazeera.
Gunmen have killed 8 people and kidnapped 38 others in 2 attacks on churches in northern Nigeria.
Morning services at a Catholic church and a Baptist church in the state of Kaduna were targeted. It comes weeks after gunmen killed 40 people at a church in the southwest. Leaders in East Africa have agreed to establish a regional force to intervene in the conflict in the east of Democratic Republic of Congo. The announcement was made after a meeting of the 7-member East African community in Nairobi. But Congo says the force should not include troops from Rwanda. The Congolese government accuses its neighbor of supporting rebel fighters linked to a recent flare-up of violence. The Ukrainian president says Africa is being held hostage by Russia's war. The invasion has led to global food shortages, as well as rising threats of famine across the African continent.
I address you in a state of emergency, when we have a war, in an emergency for the whole world, when Africa is actually taken hostage of those who started the war against our state. This war may seem very distant to you and your countries, but catastrophically rising food prices have already brought it home to millions of African families, as well as to many families in Asia, Europe, and Latin America. The unjust and provoked by Russian war level of food prices is painfully felt on all continents.
The European Union is also blaming Russia for critical shortages of grain in Africa. EU diplomats have been meeting in Luxembourg to discuss the conflict's impact on food security.
One cannot imagine that millions of tons of wheat remain blocked in Ukraine while in the rest of the world people are suffering hunger. This is a real war crime. We are repeating, and I have to warn again, about the risk of a great famine in the world, especially in Africa.
Russian officials say Ukrainian forces have attacked 3 offshore gas rigs in the Black Sea. The head of Russian-controlled Crimea says platforms south of Odessa were hit by missiles. He said 3 people were injured and 7 are missing. If the strikes are confirmed, they'll be the first attacks on offshore energy sites in the sea since Russia invaded Ukraine in February. A Russian journalist has sold his Nobel Peace Prize medal to help displaced Ukrainian children.
Ladies and gentlemen,
It shattered auction records, reaching $103.5 million. Dmitry Muratov was the editor-in-chief of the independent Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta. It was shut down in March when the Kremlin clamped down on journalists following its invasion of Ukraine.
I think selling the Nobel Prize medal to help Ukrainian children is important to me because I'm a Russian citizen and Russia has invaded Ukraine. I feel responsible for what my country and my country's citizens are doing. I'm sure a lot of Russian citizens, just like us, want to do something. We're trying to do something.
Historic flooding in Bangladesh could be about to get worse. With more rain forecast, major rivers are expected to rise and millions of homes are underwater already, and authorities are struggling to deliver emergency supplies. Shortly, we're going to get an update on the situation in India's Assam state with Pavni Mittal. First, let's cross to Tanvir Chowdhury in Sylhet in Bangladesh. Tanvir, we can see behind you just how deep the water is in this street. Just talk us through what's happening.
Indeed. We're just outskirts of the Sylhet city. Now, all across the city, you'll see lanes and lanes of water like this in different parts of the city. Some parts have dried up, but most people do not have electricity, gas supply, or fresh water supply. So a very difficult environment for the people living in the Sylhet city. And these waters are clogged there. They can't go because the water, the river next to it, Shurma River, is overflowing on danger level. Many of the drains are clogged. So a lot of people actually kept their shops, offices, and other facilities closed. A major challenging environment within the city. While we were coming from Dhaka into Sylhet, we've seen villages after villages submerged in water. People are desperate, looking for dry shelter. They're going on their own, finding empty schools. We visited one school within the Sylhet city, and at least 200 people are living there, very congested with their family, children, everybody, barely getting enough through volunteers who are sending them rice and other lentils, other kind of dry rations, but limited fresh water. There's no running water, extremely difficult environment. The military or the defense force have been deployed in the entire region. Over 100,000 people have been evacuated or rescued. And there's no better situation in northern Bangladesh, in Kurigram, when the Tista barrage from the Indian side opened, the entire region got flooded, displacing over 250,000 people in that area. Now, according to the government news agency, at least overall 6 million people have been affected in this flood so far. The Prime Minister is scheduled to visit this region today. Sometime she might be even here. And some people and experts are urging the government to declare emergency in the disaster region so that all kind of resources could be utilized and people been helped in this side. Also to note, in context, this region actually experienced flood just end of this month we have visited. This is the second wave of flood. So people are barely coping with the last wave end of last month, and now they have to cope with one of the worst flood in more than a century. Extremely challenging for everybody. And the weather remained luckily dried for last 2 days. So some parts of the city is drying up despite forecasts that there's going to be more rain. It hasn't actually. So this is a big relief for the people in Sylhet. However, that danger clearly remains. If there's rain in northeastern India, that will come down to the Surma Valley, which is known in this, and flow through here into Bay of Bengal, overflowing the river, and more flood possibly could happen.
Tanvir, for now, thank you very much indeed. Tanvir Chowdhury talking to us from Sylhet. I want to bring in Pavni Mittal. She's joining us from Nellore in India's Assam state. That's really the big fear now, isn't it? That what Tanvir was talking about, that there could be more rains to come in the next couple of days, and northern and northeast India are going to be the areas that are going to be badly affected. Tell us what you're seeing there.
There is a lot of anxiety over here because the situation continues to be critical across the state of Assam. Now, we are coming to you from a place called Nellore, where the Kopili River is flowing way above the danger mark and has caused a lot of devastation. And you can see for yourselves, on my left is a village that has about 60 homes, all of which are at least partially submerged in water. And on my right is the national highway where people have set up temporary camps. In fact, they've been taking boats. Some have also just been swimming across to come to dry land. Their priority, they told us, is to save their cattle. A lot of people here are farmers, so they're struggling to save their livestock. Residents also told us that just like in Bangladesh, there is a crisis of drinking water. Their people don't have electricity, so they haven't been able to filter the water, and families have been scrambling to get something that, to get drinking water. They also told us that over the last few days, they haven't seen any relief coming in over here. There have been no rescue efforts, so they really are struggling over here. Across the state as well, there is a lot of devastation. The number of people affected by these floods has gone up. It is now closer to 5 million. Rescue efforts are being hampered by continuous rainfall and rising water levels in some parts. And because of that, over the last 24 hours, at least 11 people have died in the state of Assam.
Pavni, obviously, we're going to be checking in with you as things go on and the rescue efforts continue. But for now, Pavni Mittal, talking to us from Nellore in India's Assam state. Thank you. Still ahead on Al Jazeera, mind the gap. Britain's trains are set to grind to a halt as pay talks break down. And a ban on clothes made of cotton from Xinjiang forces retailers into uncomfortable choices.
Hello there, hot, dusty and dry. That's the forecast for the Middle East in the days to come. We're still seeing that intense heat affect much of Iraq, with the temperature in Baghdad touching up to 50 degrees and both man and beast trying to escape those hot and dry conditions. So on Tuesday, you can see there Baghdad touching 50 degrees. There's going to be a bit of a switch by the time we get to Wednesday. It'll cool down slightly. Kuwait seeing 50 degrees Celsius. It's getting cooler up across the Levant as that weather system shifts its way further east, bringing some windy weather with it. And it is rather windy for the coast of Oman, bringing some cooler conditions to the likes of places like Salalah. Now, as we move across to northern Africa, it's really the west that's getting a drenching. We're seeing some fierce thunderstorms all across the Gulf of Guinea. Some of the more intense thunderstorms affecting southern areas of Mali. You can see them rumbling around there. By the time we get to Wednesday, we could see some flooding from those. But it remains very hot and dry for much of the Horn of Africa, as it does for many central and more southern areas. But we've got a bit of a weather front pulling its way across South Africa as well as Namibia, bringing some heavy rain to Botswana with thunderstorms in Gaborone on Wednesday. That's your weather update.
Al Jazeera, wherever you are.
Overnight success. That's not really a thing. Night after night. That's the only way. Invest in consistency. M&G Investments.
You're watching Al Jazeera. A reminder of our top stories this hour. The leaders of Israel's fragile coalition government are dissolving parliament. The move is going to force the country to hold its 5th election in less than 3.5 years. Mali's military rulers have declared 3 days of national mourning. That's after fighters killed 132 people in several villages. The government blamed an al-Qaeda-affiliated armed group. Emergency workers in Bangladesh are struggling to deliver food and drinking water in several regions facing severe floods. More rain is forecast, and major rivers are expected to continue to rise. Britain is facing its biggest rail strike for decades after talks failed between the Rail Workers Union and train companies. Tens of thousands of employees are walking off the job for 3 days. They've rejected a pay increase of 2%, while inflation is at 9%.
We will continue to do all we can to find that sweet spot of compromise that is affordable for the employers, affordable for the taxpayer, affordable for the fare payer, and the RMT and our employers can live with. They want a decent pay rise. We want to give them one. We just need some compromise, a bit of give and take at the negotiating table to find that sweet spot.
Well, the cost of living crisis has affected the outcome of legislative elections in France. President Emmanuel Macron has lost his majority in the National Assembly. A new left-wing alliance led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon has become the main opposition. Natasha Butler reports from Paris.
Familiar faces and new ones. French MPs arrived at the National Assembly after parliamentary elections on Sunday that dealt a humiliating blow to the French president. His centrist alliance failed to secure a majority after big gains by the far-right party and a new left-wing alliance that is now France's main opposition force.
The success of the left was that we were able to unite to offer an alternative to Macron's socially unfair policies.
In her constituency in northern France, far-right leader Marine Le Pen was in a buoyant mood after her anti-immigration party won a record number of seats.
Will Emmanuel Macron be able to do what he wants now? No, the answer is no.
No is a word that MPs from Macron's alliance are likely to hear a lot in coming weeks as they try to work with other parties to push through the president's reformist agenda.
No, we will not have a contract, governmental contract between our two parties. That's not something we're going to do.
This analyst says that Macron's MPs may have to work bill by bill.
Another option is try and seek an alliance for each law and each reform he will pass. So either an alliance with the left when it is a text more inclined towards the left, or with the right.
The results of the parliamentary election have shaken a political system where power sharing is rare. This newspaper says that the results are a slap in the face for Emmanuel Macron, whilst this one says that France is now going to be ungovernable. France's government spokeswoman put on a brave face and said the party will find a way.
It will be difficult. We'll of course need imagination, audacity and openness.
Macron is meeting party members and allies to consider what to do next. As a president who prides himself on his ability to navigate through a crisis, he finds himself in the middle of one he'd rather have avoided, and that will shape his second term. Natasha Butler, Al Jazeera, Paris.
Police fired tear gas and beaten people with sticks to break up protests against fuel price rises in Nepal. Petrol went up by 12% on Monday, pushing up fares for public transport and goods vehicles. The government says the price rises are needed to help the state-owned oil corporation pay for imports. Thousands of protesters have defied a curfew and marched into Ecuador's capital, Quito, on an 8th day of demonstrations. They're demanding the government do more to stop rising food and fuel prices. President Guillermo Lasso has extended a state of emergency to cover 6 provinces. The protests have cost the economy millions of dollars. One of the last recognized rebel groups in Colombia says it's open to resuming peace talks with the incoming president. One of the promises made by Gustavo Petro, who's a former rebel fighter, was to strengthen the fragile peace process. Teresa Bo reports from Bogota.
Doralina Palacio says she still cannot believe Gustavo Petro was elected president of Colombia, and that the new vice president will be a black woman like her. She was displaced from the province of Chocó after 2 of her brothers were killed. She now lives in Ciudad Bolívar in Bogotá, where she helps children cope with poverty and violence.
I trust in Petro because when he was a mayor, he helped us a lot. The need to transform this country is real. Year after year, the same politicians, and this country is getting worse each day.
Many here celebrated Gustavo Petro's victory late into the night.
Millions of people have been displaced by the conflict in Colombia, and many live in places like this one in dire conditions. People here are telling me that they're desperate for reforms that will improve their lives, but delivering on his promises won't be easy for Gustavo Petro, as he does not have a majority in Congress, and he will have to negotiate to turn his promises into real change.
But not everyone is celebrating. This debate happened just outside Doralina's home. It's an example of the polarization that exists in the country today. I just hope Petro won't start fighting with the rich, this man told her, because they generate jobs for Colombian society. I hope this doesn't become Venezuela, he said. Petro has promised to fight inequality, raise taxes, and renegotiate free trade agreements. He also said he wants Colombia to begin a transition to clean energy as soon as possible.
He clarified during his campaign that this would be a gradual process, and yet I think it remains to be seen in a country that is highly dependent on natural resources for its income, how he plans to go ahead to promote this transition, which I believe is a very good one for Colombia and for the world, in a viable way that doesn't mean putting excessive stress on the economy, and that actually allows him to advance on his more social agenda.
Petro has said his priority is to start working towards long-lasting peace in the country. Even though the Colombian government signed a peace deal with the FARC in 2016, some parts of the country continue to live in conflict. The left-wing rebel group known as the ELN, composed of around 2,500 fighters, announced they were ready for talks with Petro's government. And that's why people like Doralina are excited about this new beginning for the country. An era, she hopes, where dialogue and not war will prevail. Teresa Bo, Al Jazeera, Bogotá.
The dams that supply water to 5.5 million people in the Mexican city of Monterrey are about to run dry. The National Water Commission says more than half of the country has run out of water. The shortages are leading to growing public anger, as Manuel Rapolo reports.
There's a water crisis playing out in Monterrey, Mexico. Taps across the city have been running dry since the weekend. Desperate, Maria Luisa Robles, a local resident, has been filling up buckets from a nearby municipal water tank. Robles says it's the only water available for drinking. She also plans to use it for cooking and cleaning her home.
Many people ask us why we take that water, but what else are we supposed to do?
City officials in Monterrey have been limiting water access to 6 hours a day. The water shortage has led to growing public anger. Many say the response by public officials to meet the needs of residents has not been enough.
Every day they cut off our water at 9 in the morning and it doesn't come back until 1 the next morning. We're staying awake waiting for the water to arrive, filling containers. This is the way it has been since the water cuts were announced.
More than half of Mexico is currently facing moderate to severe drought conditions, according to CONAGUA, Mexico's National Water Commission. In other parts of Mexico, like Hermosillo, a lack of access to potable water recently sparked demonstrations where thousands marched on the streets of the city. Experts say climate change is behind the excessive heat fueling the crisis. The city of Monterrey, in the Mexican state of Nuevo León, is regarded as Mexico's industrial capital. Mexico's president has placed part of the blame for the water shortage on excessive extraction of water by bottling companies.
The case of Nuevo León is one to think upon. It has to be said, there are too many companies that have been installed that require water, where there is simply not enough water. So, there must be better planning moving forward. This situation will be resolved. We are all helping. The private sector is helping too. But we will have to think about how we move forward.
Water and sewage authorities in Nuevo León warn the two main dams that supply water to the Monterrey metropolitan area, home to some 5.3 million residents, could be completely dry as early as Tuesday. With a hot summer in Mexico just underway, many hope the seasonal rains that come with it will arrive soon and put an end to the worsening water crisis. Manuel Rapalo, Al Jazeera.
Record temperatures for this time of year in the United States are making it more difficult to control wildfires. Authorities in the state of New Jersey say they've managed to contain about 45% of a blaze there. 120 million people have been advised of excessive heat across the country, and temperatures in some parts are about 7 degrees above average. An investigation by the New York Times has concluded that an Israeli soldier most likely fatally shot Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. It adds to a growing body of independent probes that have found that the Palestinian-American correspondent was killed by Israeli forces. The New York Times report says no armed Palestinians were near Shireen at the time she was killed in the occupied West Bank. It's dismissed early suggestions by Israel that Palestinians may have been to blame for the incident. Shireen Abu Akleh was shot in the head while on assignment in Jenin. Members of the international community have condemned her killing and continue to call for an investigation. Abu Akleh was with Al Jazeera for 25 years, covering the story of the Israeli occupation. She was known as the voice of Palestine. A U.S. ban on goods imported from China's Xinjiang region is due to come into force. It's a major exporter of cotton and tomatoes, but it's also where Uyghurs and other Muslim groups are being held in detention camps. Many people are concerned the move could further disrupt global supply chains. Katrina Yu reports from Beijing.
Japanese retailer Muji has hundreds of stores around the world. But what sets it apart from other international brands is its choice to promote the use of Xinjiang cotton. Sourcing materials from the autonomous region in northwestern China has become a minefield for companies exporting to the US. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act presumes all Xinjiang goods are made with forced labor unless proven otherwise.
They're being asked to prove a negative, and that's extremely difficult to do. So you're going to have implementation problems with this law. On the other hand, China is really not making things any easier for itself. What they've been doing is restricting activities within the province of Xinjiang, making it very difficult for companies to move around, very difficult to get documentation.
A range of commonly used materials are sourced from the region, including a quarter of the world's tomato paste, 40% of solar panel polysilicon, and 13% of wind turbines. Xinjiang is also home to 20% of global cotton supplies, cotton which either directly or indirectly ends up in the supply chains of many international fashion brands. A shipment for the retailer Unico was seized by US Customs earlier this year for violating the ban on imports from Xinjiang. Its CEO has refused to comment on where it sources its cotton from, saying businesses are being forced to pick a side in the US-China dispute. Those who do take a stand risk the wrath of nationalistic Chinese consumers. Last year, Swedish brand H&M became the target of boycotts and lost millions of dollars in sales revenue after it cut ties with Xinjiang suppliers. Fearing a backlash, many companies are quietly moving their supply chains elsewhere.
The U.S. is not the only market. The largest market for China right now is ASEAN and also Europe. So, and the U.S. is third. So, although it's a very, very important market, China has not put all its eggs in one basket.
The Biden administration has accused Beijing of genocide, saying it's detained more than 1 million Uyghurs and coerced 100,000 into working against their will. China has denied the accusation, calling it the lie of the century. Katrina Yu, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
South Korea is set to launch its second domestically produced space rocket. It comes 8 months in orbit. The test had been scheduled for last week, but it was cancelled hours before launch after a problem was detected with a sensor. South Korea has no military satellite of its own. It depends on the US to monitor facilities in North Korea. This is Al Jazeera. These are the top stories. The leaders of Israel's coalition government are dissolving parliament. That'll force the country to hold its 5th election in less than 3.5 years. Foreign Minister Yair Lapid will take over from Naftali Bennett as interim prime minister until the election in October.
On Friday, I held a series of talks with legal and security officials, and I realised that in 10 days, with the expiration of the West Bank regulations, Israel will experience serious security damages and legal chaos. I couldn't allow that. We spared no efforts to galvanise whomever was needed to pass the regulations, but unfortunately our efforts bore no fruit. Therefore, my friend and I decided to act together to dissolve Parliament and set an agreed-upon date for elections.
Mali's military rulers have declared 3 days of national mourning. That's after fighters killed 132 people in several villages. The government blamed an armed group affiliated to Al-Qaeda. The Ukrainian president says Africa is being held hostage by Russia's war. The European Union also blamed Russia for critical shortages of grain in Africa. The invasion has led to rising threats of famine across the African continent. The Nobel Peace Prize medal won by Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov has sold for a record $103.5 million at auction. The money is going to go to help homeless Ukrainian children. Emergency services in Bangladesh are battling to deliver food and drinking water as several regions face severe floods. Millions of people have been stranded. Rivers are expected to continue rising as more rain is forecast. Britain's facing its biggest rail strike for decades after talks failed between the Rail Workers Union and train companies. Tens of thousands of employees are walking off the job for 3 days. They rejected a pay increase of 2%, while inflation is at 9%. Police have fired tear gas and beaten people with sticks to break up protests against fuel price rises in Nepal. Petrol went up by 12% on Monday, pushing up fares for public transport and goods vehicles. And those are the headlines. Coming up next, it's Counting the Cost. Goodbye.
What happens in New York has implications all around the world. To make these stories resonate requires talking to everyday people.
The mayor of the city announced that he was doing away with the curfew that was supposed to get everybody off the street.
It's international perspective with a human touch, zooming way in and then pulling back out again.
Hello, I'm Darine Abougaida. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics this week. Saving China's economy, the government has announced a 33-point stimulus plan to boost economic growth. Is it enough to correct damage caused by COVID lockdowns, or is a slowdown around the corner? Also this week, the contentious Northern Ireland Protocol. The UK plans to scrap parts of the post-Brexit trade deal with the EU, but can it do so? And how will businesses be affected? And the tourism industry has had a strong start to the year despite rising prices. But is its recovery sustainable, or could the war in Ukraine hamper the rebound in global travel? It's been the biggest source of global economic growth for the past 20 years, and China has long defied predictions it would soon hit a wall. But strict COVID lockdowns, a crackdown on tech companies, and a real estate slump are challenging the world's second largest economy's expansion. So many financial institutions predict growth will fall well short of Beijing's target of around 5.5% this year for the first time in decades. So Beijing has announced a 33-point stimulus package in an attempt to boost economic growth. The measures include loans for small businesses and airlines, cheap mortgages for first-time home buyers, and subsidies to help people buy electric cars and laptops. The plan also includes big spending on infrastructure. And China has turned to state-owned policy banks to provide more than $120 billion in funding for the projects. Well, official data on industrial production, retail sales, and fixed investment revealed the economy slowed sharply in April. But the Chinese economy showed signs of partial recovery last month. Industrial output increased 0.7%. That's slightly higher than expected. But retail sales remained weak, and the government is persisting with its zero-COVID strategy despite its impact on businesses, as Katrina Yu reports.
Beijing authorities say they're racing against time to contain a ferocious resurgence of COVID-19. Less than a week after the capital eased virus restrictions, hundreds of new cases have been identified, all linked to this nightclub, Heaven's Supermarket. Its business license has been suspended, and the owners are under investigation.
Police have launched a criminal investigation into the bar and the relevant people in charge of the bar on suspected interference with epidemic prevention.
Several other people have been charged with breaking COVID rules, including 3 men who ignored orders to isolate at home. The cluster has spread to 14 of Beijing's 16 districts and prompted mass testing in the largest, Chaoyang. The reopening of schools has been delayed.
Heaven's Supermarket Bar is located here in Sanlitun, an area of Beijing known for its nightlife, restaurants, and shopping. These businesses had just reopened when this new cluster was found, and now hundreds of them have had to close their doors again until further notice.
Dozens of cases have also been recorded in Shanghai, forcing tens of thousands of people back indoors. The commercial center emerged from a strict 2-month lockdown at the beginning of June. New economic data shows China's zero-tolerance approach to the pandemic is continuing to take a toll. In May, industrial output rose 0.7% compared to the same month last year, and property sales improved slightly. But retail sales fell 6.7%, with uncertainty weighing heavily on consumer spending.
It is so incredibly susceptible to faltering the moment there is even a slight, COVID outbreak or a COVID scare even, that I think consumption is going to remain under severe pressure. And that is the biggest economic challenge for the party right now. But righting that is going to take a lot of effort, and that is going to mean a drastically different COVID policy than the one that we have in place today.
Analysts say as long as China's leaders refuse to live with the virus, sustained economic recovery will be difficult, leaving business owners anxious, knowing they could be one COVID-19 case away from closing their doors.
To discuss all of this, I'm joined now from Hong Kong by Jack Hsu, who's the Chief Investment Officer for Greater China at Credit Suisse. Jack, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us. So, do you think this 33-point stimulus package announced by China is actually enough to bring the economy back on track?
It will be one of the major supportive factors that will bring the economy back on track. When we look at this 33 stimulus packages, the most important one is being the special purpose bond issuances. And when we calculate the amount of bonds that needs to be issued, which would be 1.4 trillion renminbi in the month of June, versus in the last 5 months, about 1.8 trillion that's been issued. In a single 1 month, you're issuing about 80% what we've seen in the last 5 months. And that money will have to be deployed into work by the end of August. And when we calculate and compare this with the stimulus back in 2008, where they announced 4 trillion renminbi during the global financial crisis, the monthly spending is even higher than that 4 trillion that was spent over 27 months. So we are quite optimistic about the infrastructure that to be built from these money. And also, on top of these 33 measures, is the balancing of zero COVID with the economy that has been changing on the ground. And also because the regulatory crackdown that's pausing currently are all supportive factors for China's growth momentum going forward.
All right, hang on a second. Let's drill down. All right, let's drill down on some of these points that you raised. So let's look at the infrastructure spending that you mentioned 2008 just a moment ago. So by increasing infrastructure spending this time around, China is in fact using the same tools that pulled it through the financial crisis a few years ago in 2008. Are they effective now as they were then?
They were quite effective in bringing the economy back into a growth trajectory. You know, China have 3 major pillars of growth: infrastructure, real estate, consumption, industrials in general, right? And infrastructure has always been effective in stimulating the growth momentum, and I guess also bringing construction workers back to work. And we think this time around, it will give us very good confidence that infrastructure build-up in the coming years will likely lead to a reacceleration of growth in the second half. I mean, alongside the next few years, obviously in the short term, this is good news. In the medium term, now we have to look in the decision of local governments. When they got this money, how are they going to spend it? Where are they going to build infrastructure? And will they be building infrastructure that's very useful for the economy, or ones that may have lower utility? And that's where the medium to long-term question will come in.
Right. Okay.
But for now,
interesting point,
for markets, we should be happy with this.
Let me ask you how China is going to pay for the new stimulus, and does this in fact mean more debt for the country?
Well, a lot of the stimulus is going to come out from special purpose bonds. And China's fiscal deficit this year, according to economists' calculation, is going to reach 12%. And this is comparable to 2020, where they were briefly below 12% for the full year. And we think that whilst the deficit number is definitely high, but the fact that the currencies is seeing continuous inflow, demand for Chinese domestic central government bonds have been quite strong, the currency is unlikely to be affected by these issues alone. We also note that the banks have been holding back lendings in recent weeks because of the uncertainty of the economy, and therefore the banks are actually flooded with a lot of liquidity. So we think that the banks will take up most of the issuances, and they will be the participant investor. And we don't think the deficit issue is going to be a problem, at least not in the near-term future for China.
What do you make of the fact that there are no cash handouts that are included in this package? So in turn, how are consumers going to benefit from this plan?
Well, I mean, they announced, in addition to the fiscal stimulus packages, which would definitely bring the construction workers back to work, the engineering companies back to work, and as some of them might have lost their job during the real estate slowdown. And so that is a positive for the consumers there. Secondly, beyond the special purpose bond announcements, there were numerous rebates that's been announced on tax rebates on fees, on some of the tax duties, and also, I think more specifically, on cars. Car purchases have been given a major tax rebate in the recent announcements, and therefore we are seeing that the sector are getting a benefit of selling the same car for a cheaper price, just wasn't the case a month ago. So we think the consumers there will benefit.
Okay.
But yes, you're right. China is not handing out cash.
What impact does China's current COVID policy have on this package?
Now, what's happening on the ground is you have one person infected in the building may be locked down, but the estates, another 30 buildings will not be locked down. So people in most buildings are able to go to work. So China have adjusted zero COVID policy, and therefore it's the new, what we so-called the dynamic zero policy. And in this way, we will be able to see supply chain recovery in China, and the economic momentum of the economy will be maintained.
Thank you so much, Jack Siu, for speaking to us from Hong Kong. The Northern Ireland Protocol is a good arrangement with the minimum possible bureaucratic consequences. Those were the exact words of the British Prime Minister when he negotiated the deal more than 2 years ago. Today, Boris Johnson says he wants to fix the agreement because it's damaged trade with the rest of the United Kingdom. Johnson's government has now introduced legislation that would unilaterally override parts of the post-Brexit protocol with the EU. Well, the new bill aims to remove most checks on trade in goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland at Irish seaports. Goods destined to stay in Northern Ireland would pass through a green channel with no checks, while those intended for the Irish Republic would be in the red lane and would continue to be subject to checks. Well, the legislation would also end the oversight role of the European Court of Justice. Now, the Northern Ireland Protocol was the compromise between Johnson and the European Union to avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland after the UK left the EU. And it does so by keeping Northern Ireland in the EU's single market while there are checks on goods entering from the rest of the UK. That's effectively created an Irish sea border with inspections and document checks conducted at Northern Ireland's ports. It was also agreed Northern Ireland would keep following EU customs rules and applies EU law on value-added tax. Well, critics say the protocol is causing difficulty for businesses, but supporters say having unique access to both the UK and EU markets is benefiting them. And Johnson's Conservative government says the protocol endangers the 1998 Good Friday Peace Accord, which put an end to decades of sectarian violence on the island of Ireland. Pro-British unionists in Northern Ireland say trade checks created as a result of the protocol cuts them off from the rest of the UK. They're refusing to join a power-sharing government in Belfast with the nationalist Sinn Féin unless the protocol is rewritten. The EU has launched legal action against the UK over its failure to implement parts of the post-Brexit deal it agreed with the bloc. Well, joining me now from Dublin is John McGrain. John is the co-founder and Director General of the British-Irish Chamber of Commerce. Good to have you with us, John McGrain. Thanks so much for your time. So the UK is justifying the bill under the, quote, doctrine of necessity. Do you think that's persuasive enough for the EU?
I think we're in a poor place now. The cascade of events over the production of this new piece of threatened legislation, and it is threatened legislation. Even if it's passed, it will still have to get through a lot of hoops, and it may never be actually applied. But it is an important threat, and it is a great worry now for businesses throughout Great Britain and Ireland, but it's not just businesses, for the communities that they serve through the jobs that they create and invest further in. The use of the word necessity is a legalistic term, obviously, leaving lots of room for interpretation and calibration. The reality is that the greater number of businesses and communities served by those businesses have been getting on with the implementation of the protocol, albeit with some wrinkles. But every new regime, every new formulation of business rules does take time to adjust. And there are ample mechanisms in place to make those adjustments.
Here's the thing. I mean, there have been complaints about excessive, time-consuming, as well as expensive inspections at ports because of the protocol. Do you think that this new legislation, if it goes ahead, if it passes, will it make it easier for traders?
Well, no, as presented, it creates a very troublesome place for traders now on both islands and indeed beyond, because the level of uncertainty has been increased, not reduced. The proposed mechanisms now involving things like traders having to make a choice, and ultimately their consumers ending up being selected to consume products that are made to a British standard on the one hand, or as a total alternative products made to a European standard, on the other hand. The reality is the standards are the same, but the provision that things could vary and that effectively suppliers need to choose which regime and regulations they follow is extremely troublesome for business. It is unworkable for business. And the nature of trade on these islands.
John, for the benefit of our international viewers, I wonder if you can just give us a little bit of context and tell us why the protocol has really been a source of tension since it was signed.
People who are upset by the protocol are basically two groups. From the trade point of view, exporters from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, who have been exporting for a lifetime, and understandably so, are not inclined to take the workload of filling in declarations that now have to be completed to simply trade across the Irish Sea from England into Northern Ireland. That's an understandable frustration, but the fact that it has to be done at all is annoying, genuinely. Some people in Northern Ireland who feel, well, we never had that burden on our suppliers before, and this is a problem now because some of them are saying they don't want to supply us anymore. In reality, most traders have found workarounds and alternative sources of supply, and they are getting on with trade. But it is understandable that there is what we call an identity politics issue. There is a cohort, a minority but a relevant cohort, who have a, if you like, identity politics objection to the notion that they can't trade without formality in the way that they did previously with Great Britain. There is one area, in fact, just two areas that would solve most of this. Most of the issues of most of the compliance issues here are around the food sector. There are some others in engineering and such like, but the biggest issue is in food because it's about food safety, human health, and animal welfare, and the standards for that are extremely high across both islands and beyond. The issue could be solved about the need for checks on the, if you like, compliance and the safety of food products, food imports, food exports from these islands, and the supply chain issues, things like animal feed, as well as animal welfare in its own right, and things like animal and veterinary medicines. Right. So the entire supply chain is very secure. The signing of a veterinary agreement between the two nations with the blessing of the EU would take away 99% of those checks.
All right, let me just jump in there, John, just very briefly, if you may. I mean, looking ahead, what do you think is going to happen? Do you expect a trade war with the EU?
I can't rule that out. I certainly hope it doesn't happen because it would mark an escalation from which it would be very difficult to roll back. But there's no doubt about it. The threatening of this new legislation by really a minority faction in Westminster has raised the stakes. And it is understandable that having signed an agreement and now saying we want to go away from our own agreement, that the EU, the other counterpart to that agreement, will say, well, that's not an inconsequential matter, and that there will be sanctions on the EU side. And that is a dangerous state of affairs. It could escalate dangerously very fast. We need to get back to the negotiating table. And the second formulation that I mentioned is a thing called the Joint Committee, which already pre-exists and needs to be activated to deal with these practical issues and take it out of the political storm.
All right. Thank you so much, John McGrain, for speaking to us from Dublin. Thank you. Japan reopens its doors to travelers. The U.S. drops COVID-19 test requirements for airline passengers, and restrictions are eased around the world. Travel is finally getting a taste of a comeback after 2 years of industry devastation brought on by the pandemic. Destinations around the world have welcomed nearly 3 times as many arrivals in the first 3 months of this year compared to the same period in 2021. And the World Tourism Organization says global arrivals have increased by 130% in January compared to the same period last year. Destinations worldwide welcomed an estimated 117 million international arrivals compared to 41 million in the first quarter of last year. And tourism saw a 182% year-on-year increase between January and March. Europe and the Americas led the recovery. Europe welcomed almost 4 times as many arrivals as in the first 3 months of 2021, while the Americas' arrivals more than doubled in that same period. So people are so eager to travel that they're buying flights and booking hotel rooms, even at very high prices. A return economy class ticket between Hong Kong and London, for example, on Cathay Pacific Airways at the end of this month is more than 5 times the cost before the pandemic, for example. While Marriott hotel chain says that over Memorial Day weekend, the company's revenue per available room was up about 25% in 2022 compared to 2019. Let's discuss all of this. I'm joined by Caroline Bremner. Caroline is the Senior Head of Travel Research at Euromonitor International. She's joining us from Scotland's capital, Edinburgh. Welcome to the program, Caroline. So what do you think is driving the rebound in the travel and tourism sectors, despite that rising prices of tickets and hotel rooms that I've just been talking about?
Well, I think, as you mentioned, it's very much driven by consumer demand. That's been very pent up during the pandemic. So we've had 2.5 years where, consumers were confined to their houses. They were under travel bans and restrictions. And only very recently have governments started easing back on those. And currently there's about 46 countries around the world that have no restrictions at all, according to the UNWTO.
Right. So let's just talk a little bit about the high cost of traveling, however, because we are seeing escalating costs, and these costs are being passed on to the travelers. Any way that can be avoided at all?
Well, what we have seen is, global inflation doubling since January this year. So this is, very worrying for consumers as well as businesses. We've had the shock of the war in Ukraine, and that is causing, inflation. We've got, disconnects with the supply chain, energy prices and food prices rising. So yes, at some point, companies can't keep absorbing those costs, and they do need to pass them on to consumers. So yes, as you mentioned, there's very high airline ticket prices, but at the same time, there's so much pent-up demand because consumers spent 2.5 years without being able to travel internationally. And so, you've got this sort of really strong demand surge. And the problem is that, the industry itself is not able to meet that because, during the pandemic, they had to lay off workers. So now we've got a situation where there are staff shortages and the supply isn't able to meet that very strong demand.
Interesting. Okay. And look, I mean, you outline a bunch of challenges. You talk about the Ukraine war for one, inflation was the second one, and this issue of staff shortages. Do you think that all of this is going to undermine confidence in the global travel market going forward?
Well, when the war in Ukraine started on the 24th of February, yes, this increased the levels of volatility in the global economy. And of course, it has caused, further volatility, especially in Eastern Europe. But there hasn't been that sort of long-term sustained drop in interest in demand. And, there were fears at the beginning that the Americans would be put off from coming to Europe. But actually, the very latest data from the National Travel and Tourism Office shows growth of 700% from America to Europe. And of course, within Europe, there are no restrictions in place, well, very few. And so that means that, there's very strong interregional European demand. So, that demand is sort of localized at the moment. And of course, the war in Ukraine is challenging, but at the same time, it's not having this sustained long-term impact on overall demand for travel.
So when do you expect a sort of full recovery for the industry? And do you think this is going to be a bumper year?
Well, without doubt that 2022 is going to be a stellar year for travel and tourism. We really are seeing that this is the year that the rebound is really going to take place. And, at Euromonitor, we're predicting, growth of 84% for the full year. Obviously, the level of decline that we saw during the peak of the pandemic, we saw the industry collapse by 75%. And then there was only minimal growth of about 1% last year in terms of international tourism spending. So the recovery itself to those pre-crisis levels is going to take at least 8 to 9 years. So we really are looking at a long, drawn-out period of return to recovery and to reach those peak levels that we enjoyed beforehand.
Okay, thank you so much, Caroline Bremner, for joining us from Edinburgh.
Thank you.
And that's our show for this week. Get in touch with us by tweeting me at DarineAG. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. You can also drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC, and that'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Darine Abougaida from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.
During the colonization of Africa, thousands of artifacts were removed by the major European powers.
The French occupation gradually removed a lot of works.
A new three-part series tells the story of the struggle by African countries to reclaim their priceless heritage.
It didn't happen overnight. We were robbed over time.
Restitution, Africa's stolen art. Coming soon on Al Jazeera. Examining the impact of today's headlines.
Yesterday, our electricity was turned off. This is our life.
Setting the agenda for tomorrow's discussions.
If somebody comes to Ghana from Europe, they're never called an immigrant. They're always known as an expat.
International filmmakers and world-class journalists bring programs to inform and inspire you.
We live one people on this one planet, and we got to work the solutions together.
On Al Jazeera.
I'm Rob Matheson in Doha. The top stories on Al Jazeera. Israel's fragile coalition government is dissolving parliament after only a year in office. The country is going to have to hold its fifth election in less than 3.5 years. The coalition failed to renew a law on the status of Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank. Foreign Minister Yair Lapid will take over from Naftali Bennett as an interim prime minister. The poll is expected to be held in October.
On Friday, I held a series of talks with legal and security officials, and I realised that in 10 days, with the expiration of the West Bank regulations, Israel will experience serious security damages and legal chaos. I couldn't allow that. We spared no efforts to galvanise whomever was needed to pass the regulations, but unfortunately our efforts bore no fruit. Therefore, my friend and I decided to act together to dissolve Parliament and set an agreed-upon date for elections.
Mali's military rulers have declared 3 days of national mourning. That's after fighters killed 132 people in several villages. Witnesses say it was a revenge attack. Barbara Ngopa reports.
Malian television showed soldiers and a regional governor as they reassured villagers. The government is blaming an al-Qaeda-linked group for the violence.
The government of the Republic of Mali deeply regrets to inform that the peaceful populations were the subject of cowardly and barbaric terrorist attacks during the nights of the 18th and 19th of June 2022. A total of 132 civilians were killed by Amadou Koufa's fighters Masina Katiba. Several of the attackers have been formally identified.
A local politician says the night raids were revenge attacks.
2 weeks ago, the army was present on the ground to do patrols. During the patrols, there were clashes with the terrorists, and about 12 terrorists were killed. After the armed and security forces left, around 4 p.m. on Friday, the terrorists came on about 50 to 60 motorcycles to take the town of Dia Lesogou hostage.
Mali was plunged into crisis after a coup in 2012. France intervened after al-Qaeda and ISIL-linked groups hijacked a breakaway movement and seized swathes of territory. But despite a peacekeeping mission in northern Mali, armed groups continue to operate in the vast Sahel region. Mali's civilian government was overthrown in a military coup in May last year. This latest attack raises fears that the new military leaders are failing to restore order. Barbara Ngopa, Al Jazeera.
Gunmen have killed 8 people and kidnapped 38 others in 2 attacks on churches in northern Nigeria. Morning services were targeted at a Catholic church and a Baptist church in the state of Kaduna. It comes weeks after gunmen killed 40 people at a church in the southwest. Leaders in East Africa have agreed to establish a regional force to intervene in the conflict in the east of Democratic Republic of Congo. The announcement was made after a meeting of the 7-member East African community in Nairobi. But Congo says the force should not include troops from Rwanda. The Congolese government accuses its neighbor of supporting rebel fighters linked to a recent flare-up of violence. The Ukrainian president says Africa is being held hostage by Russia's war. The European Union also blamed Russia for critical shortages of grain in Africa. The invasion has led to rising threats of famine across the African continent. The Nobel Peace Prize medal won by Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov has sold for a record $103.5 million at auction. The money will go to help homeless Ukrainian children. Thousands of protesters have defied a curfew and marched into Ecuador's capital, Quito, on an 8th day of demonstrations. They're demanding the government do more to stop rising food and fuel prices. President Guillermo Lasso has extended a state of emergency. Police have fired tear gas and beaten people with sticks to break up protests against fuel price rises in Nepal. Petrol went up by 12% on Monday. And those are the headlines. The news continues here on Al Jazeera after Al Jazeera World. Goodbye.
Ne yapacağız? Şimdi ne yapıyoruz? Adacığımla resim yapacağız. Ay sen boyuyormuşsun bir de ben biliyorum. Evet. Şimdi kelebek yapacağız ya. Neresi nereye yapalım? Bura. Bura mı yavrum? Oy canım benim, oy canım benim.
Eşref Bey, daha önce hiç ışık gördünüz mü?
Hayır efendim. Doğduğumdan bu yana hiçbir şey görmedim. Anadan doğma görme engelliyim. 4-5 yaşları arasındaydım. Tam hatırlamıyorum ama 4-5 olması lazım. O yıllarda evin içinde annem babama herhangi bir uyarı yapmıyordu. Önüne dikkat et, şu var, bu var. Dışarıda da kimse kimseye önüne dikkat et demiyor. Neden? Neden bana söylüyorlar hep? Neden beni uyarıyorlar? Dikkat et, önünde çamur var, çukur var, araba geliyor falan. Kaldırımdan düşme, dikkat et falan. Neden hep bana söylüyorlar? Babama sorduğum zaman benim görmediğimi söyledi. Yavrum, biz baktığımız şeyi görüyoruz. Maalesef sen göremiyorsun. Onun için sana uyarı yapmak zorunda kalıyoruz. Ya ben bu dünyaya böyle geldim. Ölene kadar da böyle sürecek. Geriye dönüş yok. Geriye dönüşü olmayan bir şeyi düşünmek akla zarar. Benim görmüşüm, görmemişim hiç umurumda olmadı. Ressam olacağım falan filan böyle bir şey yok benim aklımda. Ben sadece yaşadığım dünyayı öğrenmek istiyorum. Detaylı bir şekilde, inceden inceye öğrenmek istiyorum. O öğrenmek istediğim şeyi, babam 1. yardımcıdır, bunu da söyleyeyim baştan. Yani bir şeyin kokusunu duyuyorsunuz, soruyorsunuz bu ne kokuyor? Çiçek mi, parfüm mü, herhangi bir yemek mi, anlayabiliyorsunuz. Tadıyorsunuz, tadından da anlayabiliyorsunuz. Elliyorsunuz, dokunuyorsunuz, dokunarak da her şeyi anlayabiliyorsunuz. Ama görüntü olarak bir şey yok. Görüntü olarak nasıl öğrenebilirim? Dokunma gücümü kullanacağım. Parmaklarımı kullanacağım. Bunu öğrendikten sonra kartonun altına gazete kağıtları koyuyordum. Üstüne karton, çiviyle bu taraftan elleyip o kağıda çizmeye çalışıyordum. Yapabileceğim mi diye. Ellerimle kontrol ederek yapıyorum. 1 yapamadım, 2 yapamadım. En sonunda öyle bir uğraştım ki bir sürü, yani bu bir şekilde anlatıyorum ama bu zaman geçtikçe kaç tane manzara, kaç tane neler elliyorum, seneler geçiyor. En sonunda bir kelebek resmi yapmak istemiştim. Babama demiştim ki baba ya ben bir kelebek çizmek istiyorum ve boyamak da istiyorum. Babam bana düz bir tahtaya çiviyle kazıdı. Ben baktım, baba kelebek bu mu? Burası ne? Kanat. Burası ne? Gövdesi. Burası ne? Gözleri. Bu üstündeki bu 2 tane bu ne? Anteni. Ben onu model olarak kullandım, kartona aynısını çizdim, dışarı çıkardığım zaman bakın bakalım ya işte indiriyorum aşağı gösteriyorum. Ne zaman ki sen mi çizdin bunu? Evet ben çizdim. Ya git Allah'ını seversen Eşref ya. Ya bizi mi kandırıyorsun? Sen bunu nasıl çizersin? Deyince dedim ki gören insanlar şaşırdığına göre ben demek ki hakikaten yani güzel çizmeye başladım. Bana heves geldi. Ama nasıl bir heves? Şimdi ben bunu boyamaya çalışıyorum. Babamı çağırıyorum. Baba ya bu kelebekte işte siyah benekler vardı ya, siyah kalem versene bana. Babam geliyordu. Oğlum ben boyuna yukarı aşağı çıkacağım mı? Buna bir çözüm. Baba dedim ben çözümü buldum. Sen dedim şey yap, bu siyahı öne koy, sonra beyazı koy, sonra sarıyı koy, kahverengiyi, kırmızıyı, mavi, yeşili sıraya diz. Ben hangi sırada ezberleyeyim onları? Mesela işte 5. sırada kırmızı ya, kırmızı bir şey yapacaksam 5. sıradan alayım, karıştırmadan aynı yerine koyayım. Devamlı kullanayım, seni çağırmam ben o zaman. İyi dedi, öyle yaptık. Ve ben o kelebeği boyadım o zaman. Dediler ki ya Eşref sen burada boyut perspektif kullanman lazım ya. Hayda, perspektif ne ya? Ben herhangi bir resim dersi almadım ki. Bütün teknikleri, her şeyi kendi kendime başarmaya çalışıyorum. Neyi nasıl yapabilirim? Bir sürü formüller buluyorum. Dedim ki ya ne olur dedim, gideyim dedim, bir okuluna gideyim, bir ressam bulayım, ben bunu bir sorayım, bir çizgi olarak nasıl öğrenebilirim falan. Marmara Üniversitesi var. Kapıdan bir yardımcı oldu bir bey. Beni resim bölümüne, plastik sanatlar bölümüne götürdü. Hocam, abimiz bir şey öğrenmeye gelmiş falan. Kardeşim dedi, canım kardeşim sen dedi ne öğrenmek istiyorsun dedi. Efendim ben perspektifi soracaktım da dedim. Sen ne yapacaksın perspektifi dedi. Dedim resim yapıyorum da. Tamam dedi, sana dedi göstereceğim dedi. Nasıl olacak? İşte ben dedim bu kartonlara çizerseniz çiviyle. Tamam dedi, getir bakayım. Altına yumuşak bir şeyler söyledim, işte koydular mı? Neyse. Böyle bir şey çizdi. A büyük A ama ortadaki çizgisi yok. Bu şimdi ne dedim? Bu yol dedi. Nasıl yol ya? Hocam nasıl yol? Araba yolu dedi. Peki arabalar böyle geldi, çizgi orada hop bitti. Trafik tıkandı. Nereye gidecek bu arabalar? Yok dedi. Bu düz bir yol dedi, görüyorsun. Sen dedi 300 kilometre hızla bu yoldan gitsen